colleagues, and welcome everybody to this information session for permanent missions and substantive secretariats to provide an update on the recent developments in conference management at UNOG. I know today there are too many temptations outside of this room, but I think that the information we are going to provide to you is really very, very important. We will bring you about our plans for the next several months. Of course, my team will brief you on the new schedule for SHP project and how it's going to influence our activities. I think that's very, very important. Also, of course, we will talk about conferencing activities. It's also very important to note that this year, 2022, we think we will go to pre-COVID level as far as conferencing with interpretation are concerned, about 3,000 conferences. So that means that the activities in this sector are back to pre-COVID time. Of course, the total number of meetings remain lower than before COVID, but it's also the result of many meetings without interpretation being hybrid or virtual. Also, we'll talk about the future of conferencing, about the important work which is being done by DCM in this regard. We know that the member states have different views on how to proceed. We all are aware that we can proceed only with the support of member states, all of the member states. We need a consensus. But we also understand that the year 2023 is going to remain still a year of pandemic, at least in some parts of the world. We understand that not everybody, not from all the member states, will be able to travel to Geneva to participate in the activities. So we made the decision to go on with our business continuity mode for at least first 6 months of 2023. That would allow us to provide you with hybrid conferencing, but of course we will need to discuss the financial consequences of this decision with substantive secretariat and also with our colleagues in New York. Also, when we are talking about conferencing in connection with SHP, we will say how our new modernized buildings is going to be prepared for these hybrid conferences. We hope that all the conference rooms after renovation will be able to host hybrid conferences. Of course, if you, the member states, decide to give us this mandate. Also, we would inform you about our preparedness to winter. This year, we can't exclude certain challenges as far as energy is concerned, but I would like to thank my team, which have been preparing the plan and possible scenarios or possible solutions over the last several months. So we think that we are prepared to different types of scenarios for this winter, and of course, we will also inform you about it. So having said that, I will pass the floor to my colleagues and hope you will obtain all the necessary information as far as all these important issues are concerned. Over to you, dear colleagues.
Thank you very much, DG. Very much appreciated. Thank you, everybody who has come. I know it can be a bit of a challenging day with lots of people. On the other hand, it does reward physical presence because, of course, you have a moment to take a look at the bazaar after the meeting. So as you can see, here's our agenda. The DG has shared some thoughts with us. We'll talk a little bit about workload, etc. So we've already gone through the agenda. Let's get right down to it. Next slide, please. So one of the things that, just as the DG has mentioned, you can see that as a rule, before COVID of course started in 2020, we were doing around 12,000 meetings a year. The most important number here is the second from the bottom, is the meetings with interpretation, because these are the calendar meetings, not only calendar meetings, of course, but this is where the resource-rich meetings. Many of those 12,000 meetings just involved use of a room. And we believe that the majority of those have switched to fully virtual. What we've seen is, then this is very much the hard work of our colleagues in Division of Administration, is that the conference rooms have been fully equipped for hybrid, the ones that are open, and we're on track to have, as we expect, we will end the year with as many meetings with interpretation as we did before COVID. This is a great achievement and very much a credit to colleagues across the system. Next slide. We also were able to keep up with documentation. You can see that the documentation has been relatively standard, around 70 million words. We had a peak at 2019, that was unusual, 79 million words. 2020 was back to a comparable level, 2021. What we're seeing, however, this year is we've actually had a bigger increase in documentation, and this has some consequences I'll go into later on. There's two things I am very proud of. One is that all of the documents that are submitted on time and are within the established word limits, all of those documents are issued, 100% of them per the compliance, the KPI. So we're very proud our documents are issued on time. And then the productivity rate, what this shows is that our translators are actually producing more work with the same amount of time. So this is very much a credit to our colleagues in translation. Next slide, please. And we pass the floor to Clemens.
Thank you, Kira. Thank you, Kira. I'm Clemens Adams, Director of Administration. Welcome. I'd like to give you a quick overview of what's happening with the Strategic Heritage Plan, short SHP, where we are really, as the slide shows, in a highly active phase. A significant portion of the historic part of the Palais is under renovation, some of them nearing completion, and others have yet, like the library, have yet to be tackled before we get here into this part of the complex, the e-building complex. What does that mean in context of conferencing? We will roughly stay at the same level of conferencing capacity that we have so far. That means we do meet all scheduled meetings that the GA has approved as part of the conference calendar. It will continue to be difficult to accommodate meetings that are side events and other activities, but from our side, we'll see what else can be done. I think a number of initiatives over the last 2 years have been successful, and we will try to continue this. But if I may have the next slide, I'd like to highlight is, while COVID in significant ways at this present moment over here in Geneva is over, the effects of COVID had significant effects on the construction, the progress of work here at the Palais. And while initially we saw the problem that workers due to COVID would not be able to come to work, we now see the impact COVID has had on the supply chain. And in that respect, the Director General highlighted already our effort to upgrade the conference facilities. And in a number of areas, we de facto have redesigned from the original design to the design to ensure that we have our technology up to technological standards that has really very quickly and rapidly changed over the last 2.5 years. And so components that are necessary to enable remote conferencing participation and support have been ordered, but they are on significant backlog. So overall, what we are currently projecting compared to what we have reported earlier is up to 6 months delay, 6 months, because we had hoped to close, as we briefed you before, the facilities here in January, and that will only be now based on the current predictions of our contractor be in mid of July. So in that respect, there is a little bit of reprieve as we see it during the early part of next year, where we still have the e-building conferencing facilities, but some of the facilities in the historic part, specifically in the area, what we call AB wing of the Peupartout, will gradually open, and therefore the capacities in that area will become available before we are receiving then back the assembly building probably in, the contractor says April. Frankly, my guess is more like April, May, June, that those facilities will become available in the A building, followed by the A B wing of the Peuple. When we have all conferencing facilities in that area back, then will be the ability to close the conference areas here in the E building. So we will maintain that minimum capacity that we have had right now. We'll maintain, just we use different conference rooms. As you may have seen, we have already reconfigured the temporary structure tempus. It's a large room. We have the assembly hall. So we will have two major facilities for 600 and more delegates, and all the facilities in the historic Palais at that time, plus a media briefing room that is brand new and will help us to actually free the traditional room 3 that was reserved entirely for the press briefings. So just one additional point, as you see mentioned in the slide, we have worked with WHO and ILO, and based on their needs, we will be accommodating them. We have been planning our colleagues in conferencing accordingly, so that is there. In terms of moves, we will change also the schedule. We had hoped to do some moves already towards the end of this year, starting early next year, but most likely the moves will not take place before March, maybe even April. We have a certain period in which the moves can happen without impacting the overall schedule. But overall, the work is progressing, and I think also, as we haven't had a separate briefing, happy to say that the project actually has become significantly back on budget. Our projections were previously that we would have a significant overrun. However, due to having now seen the results of the competitive bidding and the projections of the residual requirements of renovations and the period of work required, we seem to be within 1.5% off budget based on our current projection. Again, this is really in the rounding error of ensuring that the project can be delivered within budget, but I'm very proud. So here on this slide, and it's more for you to take as reference rather than to read it on the screen, is indicative dates that, based on the advice of our construction contractor, have been published here. Let me just then switch over to an issue that often comes up with individual member states, delegations, entities who want to organize events or meetings here on the premises. Here, I think I'd like to highlight that there we have some ground rules that are universally adopted over UN premises, and we have here reflected them. Again, I think key point is that the UN as a non-secular organization would not be in a position to, and non-political in that respect. The UN organization as such obviously would not allow political parties or political-based events or religious-based events to take place. And so these requests for use of the facilities for that purpose cannot be supported. Again, if I may just then refine a little bit the initial introduction that the Director General initially provided in terms of business continuity. So what is next? What we have told and you have experienced that so far we are on request providing the participation in meetings also through remote and supporting delegations who would like to be supported in that respect to participate in meetings. That has been made possible due to arrangements that the financial authority, the highest financial authority of the organization, the controller in New York, had given us green light to actually incur expenditures that had not been budgeted for. And there the rationale is that the entities that are being supported would obviously be hindered in implementing their mandates if conferences that are necessary in order to implement the member states' mandates would not be provided for. So the arrangements that have been put in place for this year and are expected to be continued as long as we do have the business continuity mode, which we expect to be in place probably at least until mid of next year, until perhaps everyone can again freely travel. Under that framework, the substantive entities, the budgets of the substantive entities that are supported are being charged for the extra costs that are unbudgeted for. And those entities that do not have the necessary resources in their budget, because their budget is largely, for instance, associated with financing the positions that are in that area. In those cases, the work is with the controller to find some ways to ensure that those costs are met. So, as I said, we are looking at extending the business continuity until probably mid next year. So in that respect, requests for hybrid meetings, remote meetings will continue to be possible. And we are looking at seeing reimbursement from the substantive entities that benefit from those activities. With regards to overall budget, I think it is very important to recognize that there is kind of an ecosystem of providing support to conferences. So while the entity that my colleague Kira Kuglikova leads focuses on providing all the conferencing support in terms of the language support, my division provides the technical support and is a critical enabler, and in order to ensure that member states can benefit from conferences here, both sides of that, I would say both sides of the coin need to be supported. We have seen that in successive years, key resources through cross-cutting budget cuts in the Division of Administration's budget here have been really significantly reduced. Again, ultimately, without having the technical support that helps to run those conferences, to set them up, to provide the technical support in terms of audiovisual support, the conference cannot happen. There may be then interpreters available, but they could not actually benefit from the room. So I think here it is important, and I think that's for me the key point here to raise is there are two sides to the coin, and the funding on both sides need to be guaranteed in order to ensure that the support to conferences can go on in an unimpeded manner. And so in that respect, it is important to see that also the necessary mandates are being provided. And so here, one point that I'd like to really strongly emphasize is that we recognize that there is not a common opinion on the provision of but we feel that having seen, and I think Kira will come back to this on the survey for conference today, tomorrow, that there is clearly significant advantages in order to have that technical capability to have remote support. It doesn't mean that it needs to be, everything needs to be enabled for remote, but I do think there are significant advantages to enable this. In order to do so, beyond business continuity, member states will have to agree on the way forward. And in that respect, we're mindful that in the discussion on the conference on Committee on Conferences, there has been a significant dialogue on those matters. And we also note that the ACBQ had recommended that the Secretariat conducts rigorous assessment on hybrid meetings. And obviously, this is a recommendation from the Advisory Committee for Budgetary Questions. However, it will be ultimately a member states' decision in terms of the resolution of the General Assembly if that recommendation would be honored. But we see encouragement that the Advisory Committee on Financial Questions at least highlights to member states that this is something that they, in their expert knowledge, think is something to be reviewed, and a mandate be given to the Secretary General to actually further review this matter in order to have clarity. We are preparing, as of this month, already the budget for 2024 without a clear signal on the way forward in that respect. Again, like for 22 and for 23, there would be no funding included for hybrid meetings. So here it is important that these matters be tackled and the decisions in one or the other way be given to the Secretariat. Without any decision, as soon as business continuity is withdrawn, we will be reverting only to the regular meeting in person. I think that's my part. Over to you, Kira.
Thanks so much, Clemens. And we know that there's a lot of discussion on this, as Clemens had mentioned, in New York, but it is very much, it is not only a budget issue, but it is really primarily a mandate issue. And there are a number of things that gets touched on in the mandate. There needs to be a variety of parameters laid out, as well as workload standards for interpreters, technological issues. We understand there's concerns about universal access, IT security, et cetera. So there are a number of issues that remain to be resolved, but it is being actively discussed in New York. Just a reminder, I want to thank so many of you who have come in person and are wearing a mask. That's great. I don't know if your experience is this, but I've certainly in my office, we've seen a number of people have come down with COVID again. So it is still an issue. Of course, you can take your mask off when you're speaking. Fortunately, there are no other restrictions. You may recall back in 2020 and 2021, we had capacity restrictions, which had complicated things quite a bit, including how many interpreters could work in the booths. But really, at this point, the primary requirement is that people wear masks while they're in the rooms. Next slide. So I know we've done 2 years of remote meetings now with, and we've all learned that calling into a meeting from your car on a phone probably isn't going to give the sound that our interpreters need. We continue to have some issues with that. I think it's much improved, and I really want to again thank everybody who's taken and made the effort to invest in, a better microphone and such, and makes an effort to participate from a room that's quiet, etc. We do still have a few interpreters who are on noise rest. This is still an issue, but we're hoping that over time they will get better. If you're concerned, and I think people here, it's really not so much of an issue, but what becomes more problematic is, say, when you have people connecting from Capitol who couldn't come here. Sometimes we have people with NGOs in the field. We did put together a variety of resources to give people some tips on things to think of before they participate. We also have video explainers, etc. And there is onboarding, etc. for some of the big meetings. So we appreciate everybody's help with that. But what it does happen, though, that if the sound is bad enough and the interpreters just can't work with that, we will stop interpretation for the meeting. We know that's a problem for everyone, and that's partly why we try to avoid that through pre-testing and things like that. Next slide. So over the time of COVID, we had some evolution initially because we were having unlimited active remote participation, and the audio stress that put on the interpreters. It was globally agreed that those meetings would be for 2 hours. So this was a big problem for the substantive secretariats in the member states, because the reason why you have meetings is to get work done. And if your meeting is 2 hours and not 3 hours, that means you're not able to get as much done. Because now we're able to meet in person again, not completely, as the DG had outlined with some of the travel restrictions, but primarily people who are here in Geneva can come to the room and join in person. And there's so many benefits from having in-person meetings. What we're doing now, as a rule, many of our meetings are now 3 hours, but there is an upper limit of 30 minutes on active remote participation. And I emphasize active remote because a video statement that we receive at least a week in advance with proper quality, along with a transcript, isn't considered active remote participation because we know that the sound will be good enough. So video statements are not included in that 30-minute limit. And of course, it's up to the Secretariat to determine how they want to manage those 30 minutes. But once the 30 minutes are exceeded, we are, as a rule, then discontinuing interpretation of remote participants. So we appreciate that everyone plans to have meetings this way. But we think that this approach has worked pretty well for all parties. It supports our interpreters, and it does allow the meetings to get their work done. Next slide. So meetings planning for 2023. So we don't have the same restrictions we used to have from COVID, but what we still have are the SHP restrictions. And Clemens explained which rooms are closed, what's unavailable. We have a little bit, it's around 50% of our regular capacity. Once the stuff that's being renovated comes back and e-building closes, we'll still have about 50% of our capacity. This has been planned from the beginning, and the idea is we can accommodate all of the calendar of meetings, the things that are officially on the UN calendar. Those can be accommodated, but it's very tight. And whereas in the past, we were able to, if somebody said, okay, well, no, we'd rather be in this room and not that room, sometimes we could accommodate that. Or if we needed to change dates, we had much more flexibility. Now we have very little flexibility. We know this is frustrating. And there's a couple, sometimes it's frustrating because important parties need to change their plans. It's also frustrating for certain bodies that are used to having a lot of side events. We don't always have those rooms anymore. So a lot of informals and such have had to be held virtually. But what we're asking is that to be as patient as possible with this and try to plan well in advance and not necessarily lock everything in, and especially not tied to a specific room. Once e-building closes, we'll have 2 large conference rooms. We'll have Tempest, which is now one big conference room that takes 600 people, and we'll have the assembly hall back. We won't have as many large rooms, so our flexibility will be limited. As a rule, we'll do our best to get people what they want, but we won't be able to necessarily confirm the specific room allocation until 1 week prior to the event. We know that that's frustrating, but it's really just a function of needing to fit all the meetings on the calendar into the small number of rooms. Next slide. Okay, Clemens, it's back to you.
Thank you, Kira. We have conducted, under my colleagues Daniela Wirth's oversight, review of our response plan. So I would encourage and ask you to give us an overview. Please, Daniela.
Thank you, Clemens. So yes, we decided to give you a brief update on where we stand with the preparing for a potential energy crisis, because we are continuing to receive a lot of questions on this issue. And as you know, Europe is currently planning, across Europe, countries are planning, for their energy crisis preparedness. And that's because they want to be ready to address potential uncertainty and potential systemic supply risks that might be coming forth this winter. And that also includes our host country, Switzerland, and neighboring France. So they've also started preparing, and they're responding to the situation, and they've already implemented various measures. And in particular, the focus has been on energy efficiency campaigns. Some of you might have seen the communications that went out by the Swiss host country. We wanted to also be on the cautious side here at UN Geneva, and this is why we decided to react early to this and be prepared early. So because it's always important for us that we can mitigate any potential impact that can impact our delivery of our mandates. So this is why we decided, okay, let's not wait, let's be prepared early, because also we are concerned about everybody's safety. To be addressing this issue, a technical task force was set up with 2 goals. And one was to assess the existing energy saving capabilities that we already have at UN Geneva. And then, of course, the second goal was to develop a response plan. And here we are considering general business continuity considerations. And for example, we want to ensure that our conferencing activities can take place. That's a key priority at UN Geneva. And in general, we are also committed to continue liaising very closely with our host country authorities. And we will continue to also issue regular communications with all the stakeholders, as we have done during the pandemic. So we're taking a similar approach, being proactive and communicating continuously. Next slide, please. In terms of the energy crisis plan, we decided to address 3 scenarios. The first scenario, 1A, is actually already occurring. So it's the current scenario. And this is when the Swiss authorities are encouraging people, services, and industries to generally reduce their energy consumption. And this is happening. The Swiss have, instructed the general population, the businesses, to implement energy savings campaigns. So we similarly have instructed and sent information to all our personnel, and we're asking them to implement energy reduction measures that are both outlined in the Swiss campaign, and we've added a bit to this. So we asked them to do that both at home and at the office. So in this scenario that we're currently at, all our activities continue without disruption. Then there's scenario 1B, and this is when the Swiss may come to us and say, you need to reduce your energy consumption by a larger amount. They may even give us a certain percentage and say, maybe 30 to 40%, please reduce your energy, because the situation gets more dire. In this case, some of our activities might be downsized, and might have to be downsized so that we can reach this necessary energy consumption. And here we may ask our personnel that can do so easily to work from home. We may be closing certain buildings where it's possible, and we would be maybe further reducing the heating temperature and some more measures. So this is scenario 1B. Obviously, we're not there. We're in scenario 1A. Then there's scenario 2. And again, this is something, by the way, that the Swiss are also preparing for. Their scenarios are like 4 levels. Our scenario 2 is like their scenario 4, when there may be foreseen planned power shutdowns. This is also called planned load shedding. So this means that because the situation in terms of the electricity in particular has become so dire, that the Swiss may ask certain areas to have planned shutdowns, one area over here and then another area over there. And this can be up to 6 hours. So we are addressing the scenario. Of course, such a situation will impact us at the Palais as well. And measures that we're considering here is that in this scenario, where we have power outages for up to 6 hours, we would have to cease all our non-critical operations on site. And this includes the routine hosting of conferences. We would, however, run all our critical infrastructure through our generators, and we have prepared that we have enough fuel for our generators to run. But again, the generators are for emergency critical infrastructures and critical operations. This means we cannot continue all the operations. In terms of conferencing, though, we are foreseeing that we would put a scenario in place where priority conferences could still be happening at one location, for example, the Tempest, which could be run off the emergency generators, but everything else would have to cease on site. This is basically it from on the energy crisis. Happy to answer any questions. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Daniela. I think it's very helpful to understand that there's a lot of planning in place. Hopefully it won't come to that, but we will see. It's good that we're prepared with that. One thing that's a bit frustrating for us is we do have a backlog in translation. So as I mentioned at the very top of the meeting, we've seen that our translation workload this year is higher than it has been in 2020 and 21. Now, our budget has remained constant. So this isn't a money issue. The difficulty we have is that we are not able to find as much temporary translation capacity as we had in the past. We have a backlog of about 6.5 million words in all languages. That's 6.4% of, 9.4% of our submitted words. But it's just as a reminder, workload is not even across languages. In New York, for instance, the bodies work in all 6 official languages. Here in Geneva, we have our colleagues in ECE. They work in English, French, and Russian. So they're not working Arabic, Chinese, and Spanish. And then with the the Human Rights Treaty Body reforms, the treaty bodies don't work in all 6 official languages either. It can be 3, sometimes 4, sometimes as much as 5, but that shifts depending upon who's actually serving on the treaty body. So when you look at the translation total backlog, the highest backlog is actually in French. English is much less. Part of that reflects that the majority of the documents we receive are written in English. Actually, and then there's shifts across that. We were doing our best with this, but we've also found, as I mentioned, that it's kind of difficult for us to actually place some of this work elsewhere. Next slide. So what are we doing to address that? Well, one of the things we're doing is we're still catching up. Actually, we're pretty much caught up from the hiring freeze in March 2020. So you may remember March 2020 when there was all sorts of things happening, hiring freezes, COVID, liquidity crisis, et cetera. We've done a pretty good job of catching up to the budgeted vacancy rate. We're almost there. And this also is a reflection of the fact they've had recent language examinations. We've been able to hire additional colleagues. One of the things also, now this is being done globally. So there's a global language exam for staff translator. There also now is a global language roster for freelance translators. So this is something that's been centralized. And there's a lot of benefits to this process. It makes it more transparent. It's global from the standpoint then that people can apply from anywhere. However, because it's a big process, it's big and resource intensive to run. So those continue to happen. We've signaled to our colleagues in New York that we need to have some new freelance exams in that context. We also, of course, explore workload sharing. There is regular workload sharing with New York and the Chinese for Chinese translation. And when we were looking at the backlog, we again appealed to New York, and it's a difficult time for them. They were in the midst of the GA, but they were able to take some pages of work in the Russian language. We will continue to take a look to see what happens if we can do more of that. There's also the possibility to use commercial translation companies. These are global procurement exercises. One of the things is they are also a bit resource intensive in that you need to actually provide samples, you need to get the work back, and then some people have to evaluate that to see whether the quality of work is appropriate. One thing we've also suggested is if documents are submitted in, say, for instance, French, where we have a big backlog, that would assist us because then we have the lowest backlog in the English translation section, for instance. So if documents were to come to us in several of the other languages, that might help. But again, that's also complicated because you need to, when you're drafting a document, everybody involved in that needs to be able to understand and review to make sure that's there. Right now, we're in a bit of a slower period. Our time frame is about, 10 weeks, 6 weeks out. So we don't have meetings the second half of December or the first week in January. So that means that the workload we're getting is a little bit slower. So we're going to see what we can do to pick up on the backlog. But this is something that is, we understand, complicated, especially for our substantive secretariat colleagues. Just as a reminder, though, this backlog is not pre-session documents or in-session documents. Those are given the highest priority. This is primarily post-session documentation. Next slide. One of the other things that's, I think, worth remembering is that the ownership of the original language for things like, for instance, resolutions or reports drafted by experts, the ownership of that sits with the drafter. The translation of those documents is DGACM's responsibility. So we use UN terminology is available in a tool called UN Term, which is available for public use. If you're curious about how the UN looks at certain types of terminology, you can review that. If there's something you see that's problematic or have questions, you can certainly you can request an update to that on the feedback form that gets looked at globally. By the way, I should have done some housekeeping. We will be sharing the presentation after the meeting, and we will circulate, I think, the recording as well. We'll circulate a recording of this as well. So as a rule then, the Secretary, we do not adjust the text of resolutions, for instance, but the translation sits with us. The translation adheres to the style and usage rules in the respective language. We work hard. Our translation is designed to reflect a neutral variant of the language. There are certain languages that are somewhat different across countries. You know, Spanish has variants, Arabic has variants, etc. We work to make sure we use a neutral variant of that. One thing I'd like to underscore, if there is a non-standard grammatical use in the original, for instance, if a certain word is capitalized when it's not normally capitalized, if there's something that's not typical and it's in the original and it is expected to be replicated in the translations, but it's not in accord with the usual translation rules, style and usage rules, then that's something that the member states should address when they're drafting the resolution, for instance. We had an example of this recently with the question of, it was a human rights resolutions using the phrase indigenous peoples, capital I, capital P. And there was some question as to how that would be reflected in other languages. That question has rolled through into the third committee, which is reviewing that, and that's still under discussion. I think it was last year there was a question about whether or not the word black should be capitalized. The document in question, this was AHRC 4878, was a report of experts, and the authors, the experts who had written the document, said this is how they wished it put forward, and that was how it was reflected. There wasn't really, the translation was a different issue. But if something is not standard, there are editors that are available. You can always ask during the drafting period. But if something is agreed upon, once it's agreed upon text, that's final. The question is, how does it show in the translation? So I'm just highlighting that to have that addressed while the resolution is being considered and not post facto, because that can be a bit complicated. Next slide. We transitioned November 1st to a new document management system. I'd like to thank all our colleagues in the substantive secretariats who used that. There was training. It's a new system. It's a bit complicated, but it is a global system that's now live in all of the DGACM duty stations. And now let me turn over to my colleague in the library. Rachel, you have the floor.
Thank you, Kira. And really grateful to have this chance to join you here and give just a couple of quick updates from the library. It's also a chance to say a big thanks to DCM as well for support and collaboration with the library and archives throughout this year. It's been a partnership that's made possible the creation of several learning events and also new and improved information products to support participation in Geneva meetings. One of these products being enhanced this year is the conference primers. So you have the link there on the screen. The primers are updated daily and they're organized by topic, providing quick access to updates and information about UN Geneva conferences in 11 subject areas. And for each of those topics, the highlights box at the top points to key current and upcoming conferences. So this is a screenshot of the conference primer on disarmament as it appeared last week. It has the full highlights box at the top, very full. And it includes the look ahead to the upcoming BWC 9th Review Conference. For certain conferences like that, we go more in depth and have what we're calling now a Conference Primer Pro version that's really tailored services and selected reading lists on the topics on the agenda of certain conferences. And these are compiled with the input from subject matter experts. So if you're interested in having the library provide this type of service for a particular conference, reach out to us. You can use that URL, libraryresources.unog.ch/conf, C-O-N-F, to access the conference primers, and you'll also find on every page a button for Ask a Librarian, which is the easiest way to contact us for information to support your work. And the next slide, please. So this is also the chance to highlight to you an event that's happening this week at the Knowledge and Learning Commons in the Library and Archives. The Commons is building a knowledge exchange and learning community among UN Geneva diplomats and staff. And many of you have already joined in events and other learning opportunities provided through the Commons, for instance, the Intro to Diplomat sessions this past year. The next Commons event is presented in partnership with the Diplo Foundation, which is celebrating its 20th anniversary in 2022 and has just this month launched the Geneva Digital Atlas. So at Thursday's event, this Thursday afternoon, it'll be a session exploring how we can best leverage the wealth of digital knowledge on diplomacy and international relations in Geneva. It's exactly that type of exchange, the reason why the Commons exists. So if you go to the Commons website, that's the URL commons.ungeneva.org, you'll find the link to access Thursday's online event. And also, if you've not already done so, you can sign up to receive the Knowledge and Learning Commons monthly newsletter. And the next issue is actually coming out in the next couple of days, so sign up now, right away. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Rachel. And I think the work that the library is doing is really impressive. I know that, you know, sometimes when you're, especially for some of the smaller missions, it can be difficult to keep track of all the conferences and everything that's going on. And it's great that you've digested some of the reference material and provided background stuff. I know that's also useful for colleagues in Capital as well. We do a global survey every year. This is sponsored by DGACM in New York, but if you haven't had a chance, we'd be grateful to have your thoughts on how conference servicing is handled in UNOG. It doesn't take too long. And I think let's do this, Isabel. Let's leave this up because it can just take a little while to find the URL or et cetera. But I think now we're ready to take some questions. I thought what we could do is maybe start from the floor, because I'd like to really thank everybody who's come in person to start with questions from the floor. We've already had some questions in the chat. Colleagues have provided answers, but we'll start with the floor and then we'll switch to the ones online. So I don't know if anybody has any questions, but please feel free.
Merci. Je voudrais revenir sur ce que vous avez dit sur les réunions hybrides et l'interprétation, juste pour m'assurer que j'ai bien saisi. Vous nous avez expliqué que les vidéomessages ne seront pas considérés dans les 2 heures. Les vidéomessages, bien sûr, en s'assurant d'abord que la qualité soit bonne, seront interprétés par contre. C'est bien ça?
Oui, merci beaucoup, Jamel, pour cette question. Le maître mot étant le mot son. Donc, vidéo message, oui, mais si le son n'est pas de bonne qualité, les vidéos ne seront pas interprétées. Donc, le maître mot, c'est bien le son et la qualité du son. On a également eu des vidéos dont le son était accéléré pour aller plus vite, et ces vidéos non plus ne seront pas interprétées. Merci.
Thank you, Marie. I think that's very helpful. And again, so in those circumstances, that video message would not count toward the 30 minutes of remote participation. Okay, I think there's a question. Sorry, unfortunately, I can't see your name tag. If you wouldn't mind mentioning, thanks. Please, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon. Thank you very much for this very informative briefing. Just to introduce myself, I'm Candy Moyo from the delegation, South African delegation. I have 3 questions. And the first one relates to the working methods between New York and Geneva. And I'm going to refer to, for example, the first committee. I just wanted to know, is there any synergy with the systems, for example, receiving emails, like first committee related emails in Geneva and New York? And the reason why I'm asking this is because in the last first committee, we had to rely solely on our colleagues in New York for any update of information that is actually put online. And we personally, for example, my delegation did struggle with you need to get real-time emails that are flowing in to get the most recent updates on resolutions. And the explanation that was given to us at the time was that the system does not work, in sync. The Geneva system versus the New York system is not in sync. That's why there are separate systems. So I just wanted to find out about that, and if you are looking at better working methods for us to get the same type of information when we sit in such meetings. The next question that I just had is the summary of the minutes or notes that we normally get. I will refer to disarmament meetings. For example, in the Conference of Disarmament, we normally get a summary of meetings. If it's a formal meeting, we will receive emails of that summary. But I wanted to know, is there a way of getting these summaries perhaps in one system that we can just go into the system and get them, as opposed to having all these emails that are coming in and having an influx of multiple emails? And then my last question is based on the interpreting, and that is normally outside of the working hours of the UN. We have often been in meetings that are after 6, where we would have to change conference rooms and go to smaller rooms without any interpreting. Is there perhaps a way in which we could look to having some level of interpreting, or even having, at the bare minimum, 1 or 2 languages that are available for such meetings? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for these questions, and I'll certainly pass back to our colleagues in New York how much the system that they use, which is called eDelegate in New York, is appreciated. At this point, we don't have eDelegate here, and this is something we can discuss with them, but I'd have to pass that back. Some of this as well, of course, is tied up with the Secretariats. Disarmament meetings here are supported by ODA with the Secretariat. In New York, I think First Committee is, I think that the structure on who supports what is a little bit different. So DGACM include, General Assembly Affairs, and they have a General Assembly and ECOSOC division that provides Secretariat, basically substantive Secretariat support for certain of the committees. Here, the substantive Secretariat support is only done in the different elements. So human rights is OHCHR, trade and development, UNCTAD, etc. In terms of the questions about the meeting summaries, again, I think we don't send those out. We do have there is a tool for digital recordings where you can go online and actually listen to all of the digital recordings, but I think what you're probably talking about is a written summary. And then on the interpretation, after hours, we do have, so as Clemens had mentioned, we have an ecosystem who provides support. So one, we need to make sure that are the interpreters available. As a rule, interpretation is over, it's 10 to 1 or 3 to 6. And the trouble comes especially if you need to extend a meeting without much notice. This gets to be quite complicated. We often give 15 minutes, and I'll let Marie speak a little bit in courtesy on this to talk a little bit about that. But we also need to make sure that there's not only the interpretation staff, but we need to make sure as well that there's sound technicians and things like that. Maybe Clemens, you want to speak? Then I'll pass to Vitaly and Marie. Clemens, please.
Thank you for this, I think, very good question. And I hate to sound as a bureaucrat, but it is you, member states, who have given a very clear framework to the Secretariat for the meetings. And frankly, there is a meeting period every day from 10 to 1, and another period from 3 to 6 that is mandated, and that's also the basis for budgeting. So I think we have, as my colleague Kira has explained, tried to find accommodation to briefly extend meetings, but that is the legislative framework that has been established by you, member states. And so I just wanted to make it very clear. Frankly, here in Geneva, we have in many ways shown quite some flexibility, trying to see what can be done. In New York, this is enforced very much more strictly, at least during the period I was there. Thank you.
You want
to? Yes, thank you very much, Kira. Yes, I think Clemens explained. Basically, there is a GA resolution, and with the normal working hours, which are 10 to 1 and 3 to 6. Again, this has nothing to do with interpreters as such. It has to do with the whole conference management. And there are working hours that we need to respect, interpreters included. But interpreters are, of course, available if this comes to change. You know, I just came back from the COP in Sharm el-Sheikh, and the meeting was starting at 3 a.m. and interpreters were, of course, there. So, you know, so it's more the ecosystem, the GA resolutions that we need to follow. That's it. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Maria. I think, again, part of it is the difficulty comes when you're in the midst of a meeting trying to finish something and you need just a little more time. That's the problem we have, is if we haven't planned all of this, it can be quite problematic. So we work closely with the substantive secretariats, and sometimes depending on what they anticipate, we can make arrangements in advance. But it's, as always, there's the trade-off, because having, say, a reinforced team to extend a meeting requires, of course, additional cost. Vitaly, do you have anything you want to add on e-delegate? No? Okay. Please go ahead.
If it's a delegate, it is a tool that has becoming more and more popular in New York among different committees. But then again, it was designed and rolled out specifically for the headquarters in New York, and it's not used in other duty stations. It is used only in one minor part by the Human Rights Council, but not anywhere else. Again, it requires infrastructure, support, on both substantive and technical aspects, and then, well, it requires basically complex preparatory work to put it in place first. And again, it would probably also need stronger requests and maybe push from permanent missions and individual delegates here to take this request into consideration and to see how this system from New York could become probably global, not only in Geneva, but in Vienna, Bangkok, and other duty stations. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Vitaly. So we will pass this on to colleagues in New York. And of course, this is something as well you may wish to discuss directly with our colleagues in ODA. Do we have any other questions from the floor? I think we have a couple online. Okay, let's take a look. Okay, so online, I see there was a question about when you say no budget for remote participation in 2023, what does this mean in practice? Is remote equal virtual? So this, John put the answer in: remote participation is any meeting in which participants are connected via an online platform and expect to be able to actively take part in the meeting with interpretation. And there is a difference. This was raised actually in, I think, the 5th committee. There's a difference between people participating via VTC and people participating on a remote simultaneous interpretation platform. So for instance, when I joined the 5th committee meeting, I was on a Cisco VTC, and I was able to, so I spoke into the system, my words were interpreted into the room, but I could not follow the interpretation that was going on in the meeting. So this is a bit of a nuance. So the idea is that people need to participate and be able to listen to any of the languages of interpretation, and that does require the remote simultaneous interpretation platforms. Here in Geneva, we use Zoom. We've standardized on Zoom. We used to use Interprify for a while, but it worked out better for everybody to just use the same system every time. We also have a question about what noise rest was, and yes, this is that was another word for sick leave or similar. And the nuance there is that we had colleagues who couldn't listen well enough to sound in a meeting to be able to do interpretation. So some of them were reprogrammed, they were doing other work. I think somebody was doing translation, and we have 2 people who were working in programming areas. So they were still working, they just weren't working in their core business. And then there is a question of what are the prospects for the further improvement of the speech to text tool. This is something we're very excited about. It's called FAST, so fully automatic speech to text. It's a partnership with WIPO. And what it does is it takes the sound from a meeting. Currently it's in English, I think French, we've added French now, English and French. So it listens to the audio in English or French, it converts that from speech into text, and it creates a transcript for the meeting. So that's available from the digital recordings portal. It's fully searchable because, people say, oh, it's a 3-hour digital recording of a meeting, but it's not necessarily that you want to spend 3 hours listening to a meeting. So we try to make sure that I think our digital recordings are searchable. They're time marked by who's speaking, and the transcripts are the same. So we're in the process of adding additional languages. I think Spanish and Russian are the ones. Yeah, so anyway, so we expect to be done with that. I think have all the languages available. I think we're scheduled for the end of next year. So we also have another comment. So there's somebody has mentioned, so keeping recently concluded COP27 in mind, hopefully there will be budgets for virtual hybrid meeting in 2023 and ahead to contribute to global efforts to reduce climate impact of travel. So we, again, as Clemens has mentioned, that's really a function of what the decision is going to be as to whether or not there is a mandate. If a mandate is put together, we will work collectively. Actually, it was a global effort to prepare the business continuity, and it will be a global effort then to put in hybrid and virtual meetings with active remote participation, with full interpretation across the globe. But until there's a member state consensus on what exactly is required, we can't actually put forward anything in the budget because there's no mandate for it. So as Clemens mentioned, at this point, it's going to continue to be on a cost recovery basis throughout the business continuity period here. It is interesting. We're still doing about 75% of our meetings with interpretation to have a remote component. New York is down to, I think, about less than 10%. So New York's meetings are almost completely in person now, but we still are having a hybrid component. Any other questions? Well, thank you all very much. We appreciate people who came in person. We really appreciate it. If you have a chance, do take the global survey and maybe pass that on to anybody else in your mission, somebody who has strong opinions about conferencing. We'd love to hear that. And I think as I mentioned, we will be circulating a recording of this, and we will we'll share that with the meeting participants. And I think we'll also put something on the internet page for people if they wish to follow this. So thank you all very much. Have a great afternoon.